Imagine waking up one morning and the country you were born in, the country your parents were born in, has decided you are no longer a citizen, that you are not a person, that you are, in the eyes of the law, subhuman. Now imagine that happening gradually. So gradually that every new shock seems almost normal, because the shock before it already moved the line. That's not a thought experiment. That is exactly what happened to millions of Jewish people, and millions of others, in Germany and across occupied Europe between 1933 and 1945. Today, we're going to talk about the Holocaust, not just what happened, but how it happened. Because the how is the part that should terrify us most. To understand Nazi Germany, you have to understand the Germany that came before it, and how utterly broken it was. After World War I ended in 1918, Germany was humiliated. The Treaty of Versailles forced them to accept full blame for the war, pay enormous reparations, and give up huge swaths of territory. The German economy, already battered, went into freefall. By the early 1920s, hyperinflation had become so extreme that people were carrying wheelbarrows of cash just to buy a loaf of bread. Savings that families had spent lifetimes building were wiped out overnight. Then came the Great Depression. By 1932, nearly a third of the German workforce was unemployed. People were desperate, humiliated, and furious. They wanted someone to blame, and they wanted someone to promise them that things would get better. That is the soil that Adolf Hitler grew in. Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis, offered a simple story. Germany hadn't lost the war because of military failure. It had been stabbed in the back by communists, by weak politicians, by Jews. It was a lie, but it was a powerful one. And in a country gasping for air, a lot of people chose to breathe it in. Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. And what happened next is one of history's darkest lessons in how democracies can be dismantled, not always by force, but by paperwork. Within months, the Nazis had consolidated power. The Reichstag fire gave Hitler the excuse to suspend civil liberties. The Enabling Act let him bypass Parliament entirely. Germany went from a struggling democracy to a one-party dictatorship in under a year. And then the targeting began. Legally. In April 1933, the Nazi government called for a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Stormtroopers stood outside Jewish-owned shops with signs that read, "Germans, defend yourselves. Do not buy from Jews." Books by Jewish authors were burned in public squares. Jewish civil servants, doctors, and lawyers were stripped of their positions. But the machinery really clicked into place in September 1935 with the Nuremberg Laws. These two pieces of legislation redefined what it meant to be German. Under the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, marriages and sexual relationships between Jews and non-Jews were banned. Under the Reich citizenship law, Jewish people were no longer citizens of Germany at all. Think about that. With the stroke of a pen, an entire group of people who had lived in Germany for generations, who had fought for Germany in World War I, who were doctors and professors and artists and bakers, were declared non-citizens of their own country. This is what historians call the legalization of persecution. It's a critical concept, because by routing hatred through the legal system, the Nazis gave it the appearance of legitimacy. It wasn't a mob, it was the law. By 1938, hundreds of thousands of Jewish people had already fled Germany. But the majority remained, many believing, hoping, that things couldn't get much worse. On the night of November 9th, 1938, they got their answer. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, was a coordinated wave of violence across Germany and Austria. Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues were attacked. Over 7,500 Jewish-owned businesses were destroyed. Approximately 1,400 synagogues were burned. 91 Jewish people were killed that night, though historians believe the real death toll was much higher. And around 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Here's what makes Kristallnacht especially chilling. It wasn't spontaneous. It was organized by the Nazi leadership, carried out largely by the SA, the Nazi paramilitary force, and ordinary German citizens stood in the streets and watched. Some cheered. Some helped. And the international response, largely muted. Some condemnation. No real action. The message received in Berlin was clear. The world would not intervene. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, two things happened simultaneously. World War II began, and the Holocaust entered a new and far more murderous phase. Millions of Jewish people now fell under Nazi control in occupied Poland. The Nazis herded them into overcrowded, sealed-off urban areas called ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto alone held over 400,000 people at its peak, in conditions deliberately designed to cause suffering, starvation, and death. Then, in June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. And with that invasion came the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units that followed the German army into occupied Soviet territory with one explicit purpose: mass murder. These units, along with collaborating local police forces, moved from village to village and systematically shot Jewish men, women, and children. At Babi Yar, a ravine outside Kiev, approximately 33,771 Jewish people were killed in just 2 days, September 29th and 30th, 1941. By the end of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen had murdered an estimated 500,000 people. But the Nazi leadership wanted something more systematic, more industrial. In January 1942, senior Nazi officials gathered at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee for what became known as the Wannsee Conference. The meeting, chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, lasted only about 90 minutes. The topic: the Endlösung der Judenfrage, the final solution to the Jewish question. What was decided at Wannsee was the organized, Europe-wide extermination of the Jewish people. The Nazis built a network of concentration camps throughout occupied Europe. But the death camps, the Vernichtungslager, were something different in kind. They weren't designed to hold prisoners. They were designed to kill them. 6 main extermination camps were built in occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the largest. Trains from across occupied Europe, from France, the Netherlands, Greece, Hungary, and beyond, brought people to its platform. SS officers conducted a rapid selection. Those deemed fit for forced labor were sent one way. Everyone else, the elderly, children, mothers with young children, the sick, was sent directly to gas chambers disguised as showers. They were told they were going to bathe and be deloused. They were handed towels. At Auschwitz, the gas used was Zyklon B. Death came within minutes. The bodies were burned in industrial crematoria that ran at peak capacity around the clock. At Treblinka, which operated between 1942 and 1943, an estimated 700,000 to 900,000 people were killed, almost entirely Jewish people from the Warsaw Ghetto and surrounding areas. The scale is almost impossible to hold in the mind. In total, approximately 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust, 1/3 of the entire world's Jewish population. An estimated 1.5 million of the victims were children. The Nazis also targeted and killed hundreds of thousands of Roma people, disabled people, gay men, Soviet prisoners of war, and political opponents. The total death toll of Nazi persecution stretches to 11 million or more. It would be wrong to tell this story without saying this clearly. People resisted. In April 1943, the Jewish residents of the Warsaw Ghetto, knowing they were slated for deportation to Treblinka, rose up against the Nazis in armed revolt. With a handful of pistols, some homemade grenades, and sheer determination, they held off the German military for nearly a month. The Nazis expected it to take 3 days. Uprisings also took place at Sobibor and Treblinka. Small acts of defiance, hiding children, forging documents, refusing to cooperate, happened every single day, in conditions that make the courage involved almost incomprehensible. And then there were the rescuers, people like Irina Sendler, a Polish social worker who smuggled approximately 2,500 Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto, hiding their names in jars buried under an apple tree. Like Nicholas Winton, a British stockbroker who organized the transport of 669 mostly Jewish children from Czechoslovakia to Britain in 1939. Like the entire village of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon in France, which sheltered thousands of Jewish people over the course of the war. Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Memorial Authority, has recognized over 28,000 individuals from more than 50 countries as righteous among the nations, non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish people during the Holocaust. The real number, almost certainly, is far higher. These stories matter, not to soften what happened, but because they tell us something true. Even in the darkest possible conditions, people made choices, and some of them chose humanity. As Allied forces advanced into Nazi-occupied Europe in 1944 and 1945, they began liberating the camps. What they found broke hardened soldiers. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, upon visiting the Ohrdruf concentration camp in April 1945, ordered as many soldiers, journalists, and local German civilians as possible to witness the evidence, because he feared that someday someone would claim it never happened. He was right to fear that. The Nuremberg Trials, held between 1945 and 1946, brought 24 major Nazi war criminals before an international military tribunal. 12 were sentenced to death. For the first time in history, the concept of crimes against humanity was applied as a legal framework, establishing a precedent that would shape international law for decades. But justice, as much as any justice is possible, came slowly and imperfectly. Many perpetrators escaped. Some fled to South America. Some quietly resumed ordinary lives in post-war Germany and elsewhere. The hunt for Nazi war criminals continued for decades. Adolf Eichmann, one of the key architects of the final solution, was captured by Israeli intelligence in Argentina in 1960 and executed after a trial in Jerusalem in 1962. John Demjanjuk was convicted in Germany in 2011 at the age of 91. The Holocaust did not happen because of one man. That's the easy version, and it's wrong. It happened because of thousands of bureaucrats who signed the paperwork, thousands of soldiers who carried out the orders, thousands of ordinary citizens who watched and said nothing. It happened because of propaganda that made hatred feel like logic, and because of laws that made persecution feel legitimate. It happened in increments. First a boycott, then a law, then a broken window, then a train. Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz and Buchenwald and dedicated his life to bearing witness, wrote, "To forget the dead would be akin to killing them a second time." The youngest survivors of the Holocaust are now in their 80s and 90s. Soon, there will be no one left who can look a crowd in the eye and say, "I was there. I saw it. It was real." That's why this conversation matters. That's why history classrooms matter. That's why memorials matter. That's why you, watching this video, matter. Because memory is not passive. It is a choice. And the choice to remember is also, in some small but real way, a choice about who we decide to be. Never again only means something if each generation decides to mean it. If you want to learn more, I'd strongly recommend visiting the websites of Yad Vashem and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Both have extraordinary archives, survivor testimonies, and educational resources. Links in the description. If this video resonated with you, please share it. Not for the algorithm, but because this is a story that needs to keep being told. I'll see you in the next one.